In this video, I will cover best practices when photographing paintings under various lighting conditions, the difference between photographing with your smartphone and a professional digital camera, the difference in various file types produced by digital cameras, and how to color correct and edit your digital files using a free online application called Photopea. As a note, since the emphasis of this tutorial will be on how to document your artwork using your smartphone, I do not discuss the exposure triangle and have my phone set to auto exposure. However, if you would like to know more about the relationship between aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and other various aspects of digital photography, feel free to click on the link in the right-hand corner for a more comprehensive discussion of this topic. Now, the first lighting scenario will be under a cloudy sky. I'm going to use both a DSLR camera and an iPhone to document this artwork. First, you want to square up your painting with the frame of your camera, in this case, my DSLR. With the DSLR, I have it connected to my computer and I'm taking photos directly into Lightroom. This is using professional equipment and it's showcasing what high quality documentation would look like under ideal conditions. Now, with my smartphone, I'm making an intentional mistake. I'm standing back and using a digital zoom in order to fill up the frame of my camera. We don't want to do this. The problem with this approach is it gets me an image that is of a lower quality. It feels soft and kind of noisy. So what you'll want to do is walk closer to your painting so that way the painting fills up the majority of the frame without the digital zoom. Be careful, you want to keep your painting in alignment so that the edges are either perpendicular or parallel as much as possible. So something like this. This is going to be ideal. Always take several images because you never know what it's going to look like when you bring it in the computer. Now I've brought these images into Photoshop just to kind of showcase that I've done my best to try to square up the edges of the painting with the frame of my digital camera or iPhone. And the standard camera app produces a fairly nice result on an iPhone. However, I recommend the ProCamera app. It is a paid app, but the benefit of this application is it gives you more manual controls, kind of like a traditional film camera or DSLR. With this application, I can adjust the color temperature. I'm going to adjust it so it's a little warmer since we're under cloudy air conditions, and this would be the temperature. I can also fine-tune the tint, and that's going to be adjusting the magenta balance or with the green balance. Now this is the image in Photoshop using the ProCamera app, which records in a raw file type, which has more data for you to work with. And in the ProPhoto app, you can even see that the raw file type has more information. It's 15.2 megabytes, the DNG, whereas the JPEG has only 4.2 megabytes. This is the .HEIC. This is the zoomed in .HEIC. They're not as good as the DNG. On a sunny day, you can always photograph your artwork in the shade of a building. It's nice even light. Now, one thing you want to be mindful of is if there's any potential color cast from either the color of the building or the thing that is creating the cast shadow. Also, be aware on really sunny days, the image will be bluer because of the ambient blue light from the sky. Although photographing your work in direct sun isn't ideal, it is possible and can yield a strong result. One of the things that can be problematic is you may get more spectral highlights on the texture of the paint or even on the weave of the canvas. I would recommend that you try a few different positions of your painting in relation to the sun to see what works best for your particular kind of work. If you have to photograph your artwork in the studio under artificial light, I recommend having a diffuser to soften the directional light source. If you don't have a professional diffuser, you can also use an unused canvas. Attempt to avoid mixed lighting when you're documenting work inside. In this case, I close the windows because this will help when I edit the color of the photograph in a photo editing application. Photographing the artwork without the diffuser in my studio has mixed results. Initially, it looks decent in camera on my iPhone and even in my DSLR. Now I wanted to kind of showcase the impact in which a diffuser will have when you're photographing inside under artificial lighting. So in this case, this was shot with an iPhone 7 and with the Pro Photo app. So I have 3 different files, and this one, a .dng, which is just shy of 15 megabytes, was shot with a diffuser. I think it actually looks fairly nice. Now I should mention, this painting already has a high gloss varnish on it, and it looks fairly even. I'm not getting any specular highlights. This is with the diffuser. Now, if I go over to the next file, also a .dng, just shy of 15 megabytes, I think it's 14 megabytes. This is shot without the diffuser. This is giving me more indication of the weave of the canvas because it's catching the primary light source within my studio. To me, I do not like this. So whether or not your painting has been varnished or if you paint with a lot of medium, this may be something that you'll need to consider when trying to document your work. This is a .dng. Now from the same exact shutter click, I'm going to go over to this file. So we're going from a DNG to a .jpeg. The JPEG seems to even enhance and emphasize the specular highlights even more. So something that you'll want to do is if you're photographing indoors, you'll want to try to dampen the intensity of your light source. So we're going to do some basic editing of the photographs you took with your phone. Now, there's a great resource, a free online application called Photopea that does a fairly good job at emulating the base functions of Adobe Photoshop. It's not perfect, but it will get us what we want for this objective. So I'm in Google Chrome. I'm going to just type in photopea.com. Hit enter. We're going to go to open from computer. So I've already kind of pre-selected the images that I want to use for this demonstration. We have a .HEIC. This is the standard format when you're using an iPhone using the camera app. The .dng and the .jpeg, those are byproducts or the file types from using the Pro Photo app. And then I have the .cr2, which was taken from the Canon DSLR camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the .dng and click open. Now this interface, there's a lot kind of going on, especially if you've never really used any sort of digital application to edit your images. This mimics Adobe raw photo, and it's not perfect. Now, by default, it's on this nicer kind of setting, which I will admit is a lot better than it used to be. By default, it would used to look like this, which feels really quite crummy. We're going to click on nicer and kind of start from there. And so we have a bunch of different sliders or parameters kind of in this box on the right. We're not going to go through everything for this tutorial, but what we're going to mainly try to do is get the general exposure and the color correction relatively accurate to what we're seeing when we look at our work. So I'm going to bring down the exposure. It looks a little too bright overall. I'm going to leave the contrast where it's at. I think maybe this is still a little too bright. Now, I think in this instance, the temperature still seems a little too warm. This was probably due to me setting the white balance on the camera as being cloudy. Yes, it was cloudy, but I think it overcompensated. And so what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to shift the slider so that it goes from yellow to a little bit more blue. Temperature always is a spectrum from yellow, that will be on the right, and then blue will be on the left. So if I make this go over to the right, you can see that it's becoming way more yellow. See, that feels way too blue, obviously. So we're going to try to find a happy balance between that. That's close. Now, this is one of those things where it's really important for you to look at your painting, look at your work while you're doing the color correction. Now, the other one is tint. Tint is on a spectrum from magenta and green. So if I move this slider over to the right, it's going to get more magenta. If I go over to the left, it becomes way more green. So clearly too green right here. Let's shift that over. Maybe this is a little bit cooler. So I do think that that looks a bit better. Probably still a little too bright. So I'm going to bring down the exposure just a little bit more. Now the benefit when you're editing raw file types, whether it's a .dng or .cr2, is you have more flexibility and latitude to kind of extract information from that digital file. As we've already looked at those file types, some are a lot larger. There's more data that's present in them. They're not compressed. And so it's ideal that you're working from those raw file types as much as possible because it's going to give you greater flexibility when you're trying to get the color exact. So that exposure looks pretty good. Vibrance, what this does is it kind of ups the more muted colors within an image while kind of leaving the more saturated colors kind of as is. Probably less is more. I'm going to maybe put it just at 10. And then saturation will amplify or desaturate everything kind of uniformly. So if I bring this all the way down, it'll just be black and white. If I bring it all the way up, it's too emphasized. I'm going to put this probably at 10, which I think is where it was at. I'm always trying to represent my paintings as truthfully as possible when I'm editing these images. Now, texture and clarity. If I up the texture too much, maybe it doesn't look bad kind of at a distance, but I think it over accentuates everything. So I think less is probably more. I usually don't add any texture. Clarity, kind of the same thing. It almost is starting to look a little too processed. Typically just add a little bit to the image when I'm editing. We're not going to really deal with curves or anything like that, or noise reduction or color noise reduction. You want to try to get this as close as possible at this stage. And once you feel like you've done that, then we can click open. What it has now done is it's brought this photograph into Photopea, which is a Photoshop equivalent. Now there's a lot of different options that we can play around with. We're just going to kind of put on blinders and focus on what we just need for editing our image. What we can do is, well, we need to crop this. So the first thing we should probably do is we're going to come over to the left side in our tools panel and we're going to find the crop tool. or if you hit C on your keyboard. What this will allow us to do is we're gonna take out all of this unnecessary space around the painting. Now you can kind of constrain this so it's exactly the right proportion based on your painting. Right now it's just at free. If you want to kind of constrain it so it's really precise, we can do a fixed ratio. Now I'm doing an 8:10. And then I can bring this down. Now, the image that I took is not perfect. There's a little bit of distortion. I wasn't completely flush with the edges of my canvas and the sensor or the frame from my iPhone. It's not too far off, but it's not bad. So I'm going to try to extend this out so it's as close as possible. I'm not cropping out anything that's really critical. See, there's like some distortion on here. And if I come over to the corner, what I can do is just off to the side of the corner, my cursor changes from being these arrows that are on a 45-degree angle. If I just go slightly outside of that, then I get this kind of double arrow with a 90-degree turn. And what that will allow me to do is slightly rotate the crop. I'm using my arrow keys on my keyboard to just kind of nudge it a little bit. And I'm going to hit return. I always want to kind of go through and inspect the edges to make sure that I'm not seeing anything from outside of the painting. In truth, this may be all you really need. If you still feel like the color's not exact, we can refine it even further. Now we're going to come over to the right side, and in my layers panel, there is a few different options. We're just going to kind of focus on what we absolutely needed. So we're going to click on this icon, and this is going to be a series of additional adjustments. They're actually known as adjustment layers. If I click on this, this will allow us to kind of push and pull the values or even refine the color or saturation of what's present. Really, what I'm just going to do is go to color balance. The benefit of this, I'm going to just do this as an extreme. We're going to push this really red. This is not a permanent edit. What I'm doing here is this is a non-destructive editing technique. Now, it's giving this appearance of the painting being really red, but I can always turn this adjustment on or off or even delete it. So that way our original file is always preserved. In order to just temporarily hide it, if I come over to my layers panel, we have this little eye icon. So it's a preview. If I click on that, that eye goes away. And so that visual effect is no longer impacting the layers below it. Every adjustment layer affects the layers below it. What I like about using the color balance function is we saw in that initial window when we were doing camera raw, we had the ability to adjust the yellow-blue balance along with the magenta and green balance, but we didn't have anything to adjust the cyan and red. And so sometimes I feel like there's something missing when I'm documenting paintings where this can be really beneficial. So I'm going to maybe just push this slightly more cyan. It's subtle. There's also right now, this is refining the values that are fairly dark. I could always adjust this to impact the midtones or the highlights. The benefit when we're photographing outside under a cloudy scenario is it's giving us this full spectrum of light. And typically it's going to be the best results. So I probably won't need to use this color balancing function or adjustment layer because my initial source information was already pretty strong and fairly accurate. But we could always adjust, this a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. Perhaps maybe it's still a little bright overall. If you feel like that, I'm going to maybe come back down here and I'm going to go up to, you can either do levels, curves, or exposure. Personally, I kind of like curves best. And what it's showing you is the distribution of color and value all the way to the very bottom left-hand side. These are the darkest values within the image. And right now, I feel like this all needs to just be a little bit darker. All the way up here in the very top right corner, that's the brightest values. So if I just click on this line and kind of drag it down, I'm just gonna deepen some of those darker values. And to me, that looks closer to how I painted it. For the background image, I'm gonna just call this original. So just double click on the name of the layer and it'll allow you to rename it. I'm gonna duplicate this, click and drag, and I'm just gonna drag it to this icon down here. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. Click on original, drag it to not the trash can down here, but the one right next to it. And I'm getting this little plus symbol. So it duplicated it. Now, you don't have to do this, but I'm gonna call this one edited. We're gonna come back to these little shadows up here that are they're just kind of interfering with it. It feels like something's off. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to clean those up. And so we have a few different tools at our disposal that will allow us to try to remedy that and it look fairly natural. The spot healing brush over here, we'll click on that. And this is a little small, so if I need to adjust the size of this spot healing brush, there's a few different ways we can do it. I'm gonna come up to the top of my interface. Whenever you have a tool selected, you're gonna have different parameters that will kind of appear up here. So, and this is the options toolbar. And I'm going to increase this just a little bit, and just a smidge. And you can kind of see that there's this circle within the circle. So the black circle is the size of the brush. The blue is just kind of where my cursor is at. And so I made the black circle just slightly larger than the subtle soft cast shadow from my easel. And I'm just gonna click and see what happens. Didn't do the best right there. Let's see what happens here. So you did a pretty good job here. So what the spot healing brush tool does is it evaluates what's around it and identifies what's the anomaly. And it tries to sample the information kind of adjacent to that anomaly to kind of fill it in to get rid of it. And so this is a great tool. It doesn't always work as you would hope. So sometimes you can just try different sizes and hardness of the brush and that might be enough. This isn't great. I feel like there's some weirdness up here now. And I'm just doing Command Z in order to undo that. So let's just see, maybe we'll make it a little bit smaller. And if this doesn't work, we have another option at our disposal. That's not bad, truthfully. But let's say you try a different size of brush and a different hardness of brush. If that still doesn't quite work, the last resort we have is we could use the clone tool. Very similar to the spot healing brush tool, kind of does the same thing, but it gives you a little more control in terms of picking and choosing what you want to sample and where you want to place it. So I'm going to make my brush size a bit larger. That's a little too large. So if I click with this, it's going to prompt me select clone by holding Alt or K. So if I hold Alt on my keyboard, I'm picking the sample. And then I can drag that sample over and paste it. Now, the problem with this one at the moment is you can kind of see exactly where the copy and paste occurred. So it's not that seamless. What I will probably want to do is adjust the hardness of this brush so that maybe it's at 50% instead of 100%. So it'll feather that edge. And to me, yeah, up close I could probably decipher it, but at a distance, that's not really something many people will ever notice. So I do think that if you really need to edit something out using a combination of the spot healing brush tool or using the stamp tool, will probably allow you to kind of take out maybe some very unwanted things, whether it's just a subtle cast shadow from your easel, or let's say that there's a hair or something embedded in your painting that is just kind of interfering with the viewer enjoying the work as is in a digital format. And let's just say this is good enough. So if you're happy with this, we can go up to File and we can do a few different things. One of the nice things about this specific program, Photopea.com, is I can save this as a Photoshop document. So that way, if I wanted to edit this later on, I can bring this exact file into Photoshop and edit it later on. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Within it, we'll call edits. Put DNG iPhone edit. So now that we've edited our image and we've saved the PSD, we're going to get ourselves a deliverable. Specifically, we want a JPEG or a compressed file type that we can use for our applications. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to File, click on File. I'm going to go to Export As, and we're going to click on JPEG. Now, format by default should be JPEG. It might be under PX or the dimensions, the number of pixels that exist within your Photoshop document or Photopea document. I typically like to see this as a %, so that way I know that I'm exporting this out at its full resolution. Let's put the quality all the way up. Now, you can see that when I put the quality all the way up, we have this at 100%. This is going to result in a JPEG that's approximately 10 megabytes. That's fine. That's good. And so you should always preserve that as much as possible. We're going to click Save. It's done. We're going to go back. We're going to export as. We'll go to JPEG. And let's say, just for the sake of a comparison, we always want as much data as possible. I understand that certain applications, exhibitions, may have a maximum that's under 10 megabytes. So this is where you'll have to kind of figure out, what do you want to reduce? Do you want to reduce the number of pixels that are present? So the actual scale of the digital image, or do you want to cut into the quality? Now, this is going to be an extreme example, but I do want to show what happens if we drop the quality all the way down to 0. That's a little too much. Let's put it at 10%. So it's giving us this projected output in terms of the file size. And let's just do this, the name, we're gonna do this as SM. I always do that as my naming convention if I need something as a specifically smaller file size. And we'll click save. I'm gonna go and find these files. So I have both of these images up. DNG full resolution, so it's over 10 megabytes. And then this one is several hundred kilobytes. Doesn't look great over here. Now, every application is going to maybe process a compressed JPEG in a different way, but let's just zoom in a little bit more, and you can see that there's just some weirdness going on. If I zoom in kind of roughly at the same magnification, I have all the data still kind of intact for the most part. There's no real perceivable difference. This is giving us what's known as artifacting, which is a specific byproduct when you're using a lot of compression on a JPEG format. Typically, you want to avoid this, especially if you're submitting your work for a nice art competition or application. Since we've already edited the DNG, which is a raw file type that was produced on my iPhone 7 with the Pro Photo app, now we're going to edit the .heic, which is the file type that's produced when you're using just the standard camera function on an iPhone. So I'm going to go over to File. Let's go to Open. I'm going to go to .heic. Now this is under the same lighting conditions, so this was taken outside under the cloudy scenario. We're going to click Open. Now, one of the interesting things about this is we didn't get the camera raw interface when I opened up this image. There might be a few reasons for that, but with Photopea, it's recognizing that the .heic is already a compressed file type. Therefore, there's not as much data for you to play around with. So at this point, if I want to kind of adjust this in terms of the color, well, I'm gonna have to go back and use these adjustment layers. So if I click on this, then we can go into, let's use curves first to kind of adjust our exposure. Kind of deepen things. And we're gonna go to color balance. To me, this all feels off. So sometimes you just have to play around with those sliders. I can tell you one thing for certain, there's not as much richness. I'm gonna also go and let's play around with the hue and saturation, because I know it's definitely a little less saturated. I know I don't want to over accentuate this. I don't want it to look too processed, but I'm almost having to do more work to kind of get it closer because it's already that compressed file type. I think I could probably do it and get it pretty darn accurate. Just because there's less information here, there's just less flexibility for you to work with. You can always turn these on and off. And I do think that from here to there, that's a noticeable difference. Now, one thing I want to mention is there's some weird artifacts when it comes to using the standard camera function on an iPhone. If I zoom in, let's see, I'm going to get rid of that. I know I'm zoomed in a lot. In some ways, the weave over here kind of interferes with this, and I'm looking at what's happening in the background. I'm going to go over to this edit. One thing that happens with the standard camera function on an iPhone, at least from what I can perceive, is there's a noise reduction that's already applied to the image. And so there's this distinctive artifacting that doesn't feel naturalistic. And I'm seeing that kind of happening over here. It actually kind of looks oddly painterly, because it's trying to remove the noise from the digital image. If I come over to the DNG, well, I can see that there's some film grain or film noise, but stuff's kind of intact. Actually, to me, this is better. I like this. This feels already enhanced and somewhat artificial. So something to kind of keep in mind, and I think that noise reduction also impacts the color and also the value contrast on those images. We'll save this as a PSD. I'm gonna go to edits. We're gonna do HEIC iPhone edit, and we'll click save. So last but not least, we're gonna come over to file, and we're gonna open the .cr2. So this image was produced using a high-end DSLR, specifically a 1DX Mark II with a 100 fixed focal length lens. We'll click open. Now, because this is a raw image, we have our camera raw interface. This is all a little too overexposed, so we're gonna bring this back down again. So we'll have to kind of adjust the color temperature. And I know that this is not absolutely critical, but I want to show, well, how does a fairly outdated iPhone using an app that was purchased, how does it compare with something that is significantly more costly and professional? It's not going to be exact by any means, of course not, but it gets surprisingly close, at least in my opinion. I'll bring vibrance up. All right, maybe it's not perfect, but I think that's pretty darn close. I'll take a moment to open up, and yes, we'll crop it quickly. And so this is zoomed in at 100%. We'll go to here. This is the DNG from the iPhone. So this is just a little bit sharper for sure. I think that the color is pretty close, but I do think that there's slightly more nuance that's existing here. The other thing is you can see that although this is cropped in, this is a little bit smaller. I know the crop's not perfect on the iPhone edit, but there's just more data here in terms of the size of the image. Now let's go to the iPhone, the compressed one. This is zoomed in at 100%. And I know this one was already kind of weird. There's just a lack of sensitivity. This stuff feels a little bit more blown out and more contrasty. Now, yes, I could probably edit this so that's not the case, but it's just way more work to try to do that. If I'm zoomed out, looking at this at 25%, if I go to the DNG at 25%, and let's maybe crop it properly, you can get high quality documentation of your artwork if you're using your phone, you have an application, whether it's already built in or if it's an app that you have to purchase that enables you to photograph in a raw file type, import those raw file types onto your computer and use Photopea or Photoshop if you have access to that, or some application that allows you to manipulate that bitmap image or a raw file type, so that way you can get the best possible documentation of your artwork, so that way you can apply to different exhibitions and opportunities with a digital image that reflects your work as faithfully as possible.